back to the slide. Like I said, we were going to return to this, and we had the different types of running. So let's just kind of get a little more granular with the breakdowns here. So remember the ventilatory thresholds? We kind of had these like crossover points or these break points where like breathing just changes at that inflection point. So the typical break point from walking to running is 5 miles per hour. So I actually see people use this a lot in like stroke rehab, right? They'll put people on a treadmill at like sub-threshold, and like you try to break them in. Why? Walking and running are both subcortical in nature. It's just like a Parkinson's patient on a bike, right? They may not be able, they may have ataxic gait, you put them on a bike, whoo, just normal as can be. They think if you play in these break points that you actually kind of like are in flux of neurologic patterning, and you can use that because then what are you not doing? You're not coaching, you're allowing things to happen which are already there. Interesting note. When we talk about pendular running or this kind of hybrid running, which I'll talk about here in a second, Tom Michaud thinks everybody except elite runners should be running in this manner. I got my own thoughts. Well, again, super smart guy, much smarter than I'll ever be. Can draw pictures and has written more articles than I'll ever do, which is amazing. But when you look at this pendular hybrid running, what is interesting is we're talking elite marathoners. 16% of elite marathoners will have a hybrid running style, which seems impossible to me that they're running that fast and they still have double contact phase. But it happens, right? And it's all comes down to body morphology, anthropometrics. All these things matter for how somebody runs. So there's no idealized running gait or walking gait or movement. Right? It's all variable. This is the reason that Michaud thinks that we should have a hybrid running style as an amateur athlete. You can decrease impact forces by up to 35%. I was under the influence, not alcohol, but under the influence of the idea that we had to decrease impact forces to offset injuries in runners, which is one of the big reasons that we look at tibia verticality, right? If tibia's out in front of you, there's more impact. That kind of makes sense. We're going to get into the weeds on this, but that's why Michaud and some of the researchers think like, man, our biggest job to decrease injury, not necessarily increase in performance and speed, that's not what we're saying, but if I want to decrease injuries, which have a high correlation impact, think of that run easy monitor. It's picking up 4 different kinds of impact, right? Or 4 different parameters around impact. Well, the best way to do it is to kind of create like a double stance phase or this pendular running. All of that to be said, it increases metabolic activity by 5%. That is not what you want to do as a runner. All right, we do not want to use more. That being said, I also did see an article not too long ago that elite runners will generally have a stance phase or a loading phase knee flexion angle of greater than 65 degrees, and the better the runner, the bigger knee flexion angle. Very costly metabolically. But what's that reduce impact? If we're going to go on the flip side of the coin, what can they also do when they get in a knee flexion angle? Go higher in the air. As I said, Michaud, human locomotion, absolute must if you're going to be in our world, in my opinion. Second edition of running or injury-free running. I'm going to be honest, he does a lot of distillation of ideas. I think if you're high level in the endurance running world, it should be stuff you know. And I think, honestly, a lot of runners could just, you give it to a patient. There'd be stuff that'd be over their head, but in general, it could be used for that too. So like I said, Michaud, very data-driven. Nothing wrong with that at all, right? Fantastic. Looks at the data, says, man, impact, high correlation injury. We can reduce impact in these manners. Let's put that together, say that most people that aren't running sub 245 marathon as a guy, like they need to be doing this type of running. I can 100% see how you get to that summation. Well, then you introduce this guy, Shane Benzie. Very interesting guy. So he is a biologist by training. He actually studied great white sharks for most of his career. And then he got into doing ultra endurance, running. He's I believe he's from part of, it's definitely English, I don't know which part. But he got into ultra endurance events, like big ones, like the Cross-Saharan Desert Race and all, big stuff. Well, he just kept getting injured. Right? Well, then he's a PhD in biology, and he's like, I study great white sharks, and I can understand this. Why can't I fix myself? And he was going to PTs and stuff. So he just said, well, I'm going to change what I'm doing. So he started traveling around the world, visiting different groups of elite runners, right? Ethiopians, Kenyans, Tarahumarians, all the people we've heard about in these books and studies. and working with people locally and on different elite teams. He was at the Sub-2 Nike project. And he has a very different concept that is completely contrarian to everything that a lot of the data would say, and that Michaud would kind of come to that summation with, is that it's not that we need to decrease impact. It's how you actually utilize impact to allow you to propel yourself forward in space. So he wants to capitalize on it and actually increase it in most people. Interesting concept when you look at a huge body of data. It's like, dude, if you have more impact, you're getting hurt. The one side note I'll say about Shane, I was part of his like kind of little mastermind group. He doesn't release any of his data that he's ever collected yet. I don't know what I always talk about this. I don't know what he's planning to do with it. I don't know if he's tied in with a company. He has all this data. He uses, tibial accelerometers and all this stuff, tracks. He's never released a paper yet. And he's been doing this for well over a decade. So when we're talking about this, decreasing impact, hybrid running versus like maybe we're going on the other side of the spectrum, we need to kind of start talking about another part of gait analysis, which is leg spring or leg stiffness. And this kind of gets into that smoothness aspect as well. So where do you get your stiffness? Should make sense that if somebody's kind of throwing that lower leg out in front of them, they only got a couple options. Their knee doesn't have a huge flexion angle, right? Their hip's in flexion, so they're not kind of under themselves to load the hip into a good like hinge flexion. Where's that coming from? Below the knee. In my estimation, a lot of injuries are going to be below the knee. They're just going to be like running into it, creating all this like impact resistance, stiffness occurs. When we get a little more granular, if we're talking about like functional joint centration, things like that, if we are using like bony approximation of my hip or my knee or whatever it is to create stability, that's not a great strategy. It is calorie sparing for sure. It's a big reason why people would gravitate towards these things, in my opinion, that I can spare, just like if I have a lot of mobility, I want to kind of lean on, I have a bunch of coronal plane movement. We know that you're bumping into the IT band and that whole complex to create like sagittal plane movement. Same thing here. I can just lean on the anterior inferior aspect of my acetabulum with my femur and be like, yeah, it's kind of, it's easy. Easy doesn't mean awesome. And you will see a lot of people with that strategy, regardless of running or the sport. Others get it from tendinofascial ligaments. When we're talking about stiffness, that's not where you want to get it. Everybody with me on that? If our goal is to wind up these passive tissues that are not calorically expensive at all, what you don't want is to stiffen them up to be on the point they can't get into this Goldilocks zone where you have optimal stretch, wind it up, let it go. When you do that, what do we tend to see? You see more injuries in those areas. When you look at just different animals, horses, cheetahs, ostrich, optimal running, we're not saying, pathologic, the stiffness is relatively the same across like most of the research on Achilles tendon comes from horses. Right? When we're looking at treatment modalities, how we go about rehab, that comes from horses. Well, if there wasn't a huge correlation, it wouldn't be worth much. Why is that interesting to me? I've always wanted to kind of work on a project, and I think my next book may be this, that if we looked at animals in the wild, and then if you looked at animals that are domesticated, and then you looked at humans, there's a pretty big difference between a lion just getting up from 23 hours of sleep and just going into full sprint and be able to get a gazelle. If I woke up from a 23-hour nap and sprinted, I'd blow like 5 muscles at once. But should we be able to do that? Also, the prevalence of all these ACL tears in dogs that are domesticated, I don't know if there's a bunch of wolves running around with ACL tears and they're just non-symptomatic because they can just compensate. I like this idea though, because you're not going to put a human in a different environment. We can still look at things that are very similar to us and be like, is it normal to just have injuries with these things because of our environment? Or should we be doing different things with our training and our lifestyle, diet, to where I can not have to warm up for 15 minutes. I can get at a pretty high clip really fast, and I'm not blowing out my Achilles. I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows, but I think if we're going to learn, I think we need to look more maybe outside of human studies, not necessarily mice and rat models though. When we look at the stiffness, just think energy return. Where are you getting your energy? Are you, bone's not expensive, but it's not great. If you can't wind your tendon up, you're going to be pushing with your muscle. It gives you an economical map of what they're doing in running. Now this little arrow, I would say I have decent vertical oscillation here. When you start looking at vertical oscillation, the average movement up of a average to elite runner is 14.1 centimeters. That is a lot. Like 14.1 centimeters when you think of like somebody may get coached to, hey, can we run quiet? Can you run flat? Hey, I don't want to see like, this used to be a very common thing, like, hey, you need to run where your head's just kind of like on a smooth trajectory. That 14.1 centimeter average, when you get up into the higher ends, and this is from 94, the more elite, the more vertical oscillation. This is Shane Benzi's concept. The elites are just much better at handling impact, capturing it, and sending it back into the air and forward in space. The non-elites are poorer at decreasing that impact or attenuating for it, and I think that's what he's trying to prove with this research. Now here's kind of the hard thing here. The impact will be the same or greater even if you capture it and use it. Does that make sense? So if I used to think if I had somebody with shin splints and I was like, hey, I know you're a road runner. When you get back into running, will you go run on the trail for a little bit because that's going to be less impact? It's actually backwards. There's more impact because your brain knows, your nervous system knows that you can put more impact into a softer surface to get the same vertical oscillation and forward trajectory. So there's more impact on softer surfaces. You think it's less. So then let's talk about like hokas and all this stuff. Yeah?
What about the speed at which the force goes in? That's, I think, the difference.
It is.
I think the rate of force development is the issue, not the total force.
Right, and then we'll get into like a shoe conversation too, right? Like just think of the compression of foam then. So this is where like a Nike Next Percent versus a Hoka, like that's what they're utilizing, right? Is that return rate. And then it gets into, if I put somebody, we were talking about high school runners getting, hot and heavy on these types of shoes, a carbon fiber plate shoe that's going to capture energy and like push you off. If they can't handle it because they're not elite, injuries through the roof, in my opinion. Maybe we'll see that. It's also like, I don't know why Hokas became a fashion statement for high schoolers. They're like the ugliest shoe ever. From a performance standpoint, some people need them. We'll talk about phenotyping of runners here pretty soon. But this is the two diverging paths, right? If we like split everybody in the room, like I think you do the hybrid thing for amateurs, and everybody's like, dude, you need to learn how to use vertical oscillation. Because Shane Benzi is also the one that really talks about like getting this hip extension through your whole body, running into the body with a very efficient lever to create stiffness at peak impact, and then like return that back into the air in forward motion. I would be more in that camp because it just makes sense to me. If I have somebody reduce impact, we know it becomes more calorically inefficient, right? They have to kind of summate for running quiet or being softer on the ground, which means they're having more eccentric control because they can't do what? Approximate for it. Some people may not be able to do that. So what do you have to do? Put on your clinician's cap and be like, what type of runner are you? What's your phenotype, which I'm going to help you with here pretty soon. And I'm never going to get you there. So guess what? You're a hybrid runner. Right? I have my ideals of what I think is great, but like that may not happen for everybody. But if you are an elite runner, I know there's that 16% of elite marathoners are hybrid. I just think if we have somebody that, let's say they're an elite marathon, what's not in that study is, are they injured or not? And they're that style and they're getting injured. Now we have the question that Jared brought up of like, well, when do you change stuff and they're not? Well, I don't know. But if they're injured and they're in that running style, guess what I'm going after? Can I build you some springs? Like, do you know how to jump rope? Do you have any rhythm? Like, can you, return impact off the floor as fast as you can create it? Like, all these things are very important for a runner outside of just on the table treatment. This is an article that just came in my inbox the other day too that I was throwing in. So hypothesis that less movement of the center mass vertically can affect stride length, lead to more strides being used to cover specific distance, and thus could contribute to earlier onset of fatigue and overuse injury. So if you try to decrease your vertical oscillation, run quiet, whatever you want to say, you actually become more inefficient, which makes sense, right? You're not in the air. This is also Shane's concept of like how you improve verticality of the shin. If you get them up in the air, they have time to cycle their leg underneath of them and drop it down like a lever again. And again, that makes sense to me, and it gets people out of this like kicking them, out into the front of themselves, which is just the most common thing you're going to see in an amateur runner, in my opinion. So just interesting, again, that just came in the other day. Another thing that, I talk about it a lot, so maybe you've heard me talk about it and rant, but like rotation is one of those things that gets coached out of runners all the time. Like, hey, you need to look like Tom Cruise, like sprinting down. Has anybody seen the like whole clip of he runs in every movie he's ever in? There's never been one movie he's been in that he doesn't run.
Never good at it.
No, and he is the antithesis of, now sprinting, right? Not a lot of torso rotation, much more arm drive for a lot of reasons. But again, the elbow angle and hey, don't cross over. Just amateur coaching like candy canes. Like, yes, don't cross over. I got you. That's like my coaching tip of the day. It is absolutely critical, and we've known this forever. So Gregovetsky was a nuclear physicist, kind of interesting mechanical engineer. He worked with fighter pilots. From his work with fighter pilots and his own injuries, because fighter pilots are having a lot of back injuries, and he was like trying to help them figure that out, he sustained an injury too around the same time. And he started looking at torque into the ground through the foot in things like walking and running. He said, there is no way you can create enough torque into the ground to equivalent for sagittal plane motion forward to where it wouldn't just destroy a human. So because you have to be creating that torque elsewhere in the body to displace into the ground and move that way, because otherwise it'll break you. So he's like, well, where are we getting it if we're not like just grinding into the ground as we push? So this is where the spinal engine theory came from. So there, and this is, I like the crossovers of his definitions and like something like DNS. There must be a fixed stable point for the muscle to pull from it in order to fulfill its function effectively. So when you see the picture or the diagram that he draws that I'll have up here in a minute, it's literally just creating counter rotation. You may call it X factor in a golfer, pelvis, shoulder, or thorax. That torque through the spine then gets displaced through the ground, and that's what kind of creates this, like, again, if you think of the Karate Kid, like spin. Where do we not want to see the rotation displaced? Up through the head, right? So we have this kind of like static motion there. And again, it's just the most effective movement creates motion in the frontal or the sagittal plane. This is where you'll see, and you'll hear people talk about this all the time, inefficient runners, they would say like they lack stability, will have more crossover to make up for that. Here's what I would say. Those people that are running like that may lack power output. They may be very mobile and they lack stiffness, right? Or they may have a huge lurking mobility issue, and the only way they can like maximize hip extension on the side they don't have it is just like go way over here. So like, again, you have to look at all these things, but it's not just like somebody doesn't just start running like this because they think it's like the best way to do it. And what do you see a lot of high school runners do when they get fatigued? Go here. What do I think they're running into? The same bridge crossover point. What are they probably not great at? Creating stiffness in the best way possible. And then they just have to create more torque through their thorax. People built upon this. So Elphinstone, same concept, just kind of broke it down, and her descriptors are great. Nothing really different, but just like people kept building on this, and they're like, yeah, this is the way that people run. This is the way that people run. You'll still see running labs like study rotation be like, it was ineffective for, reducing impact. Well, now we have a variable that we don't even know if you should be reducing and looking at rotation. And that's where, again, you just have to go through studies very systematically and be like, does that actually prove anything that I would use, or is it just looking at like 5 variables at once and the one variable they looked at proves their point? So again, I'm not even saying that anything I put in here from a research standpoint should direct your care. It should lead you to think about stuff so you start asking your own questions. Also, I'll back up just so I can look at her picture one more time. Corey McGee, great under 800 meter, 1500 meter runner, went to the Olympics. She's a great example of rotation all the way from her foot, right, to trail side shoulder. I mean, complete hip internal rotation going through full pronation and toe off back into supination. Maybe we work on some stuff with breathing, whatever. But usually if this wasn't like grayed out, you can see the striations across her obliques. Winding up, I mean, her shoulder is probably in this 45 degrees, but look how much rotation is occurring of her torso. Oh my God, her hand crossed. Just fire her coach, worst guy in the world. I don't know how she made it to the Olympics. Best example of this, if you dumb it down, it's a drive shaft on a car that goes through a differential and makes the car go forward. Right? Drive shaft's going this way, the car goes that way. We're just in 2 different planes, right? We're going to do it in the transverse plane and sagittal. They do it in the coronal and the sagittal. Nobody studied this on how much, right? We had all these hip extension, hip flexion norms from big data pools. Nobody's looked at rotation. It should be pretty easy, right? put something on their back, have them run around a bunch, and so, I mean, it could be easy. I would say the minimum is, just because if we look at maximum like thoracic rotation, and then you kind of like break it down, 30 degrees is what I would assume to be the minimum norm. And then we'll talk about asymmetry and things like that. The elastic support strategy, still building on it, still elf stone. It's just explaining the mechanism of like transfer. This is where all the X factor stuff came from for golf. Right, so this wasn't just golf specific. They're like, spinal engine theory, cool. We'll look at this. It all came from running. And then what did they actually like go back on in golf with the X factor? They took it too far, right? We Americanized it again. Oh, you go past this point, and we'll talk about the law with that when you go past